yesterday I talked about the idea of creating our reality. So we are creating our reality whether we're conscious of it or not. So there's actually, it was really interesting yesterday on social media, there's big studies been published that's like emotion creates reality. And it was like, oh my God, you know. But yogis or like the mystical traditions have been saying this for thousands and thousands of years. Quantum physics has been saying this. And what's important about that is that then it actually means that as individuals, we have a huge amount of freedom, but we also have responsibility. And that's what goes along with all of these traditions of consciousness, right? I remember one of the first times I did teacher training, like 15 years ago, one of the students was like, oh shit, Shasta. If I'm creating my reality, that means I can't blame anybody anymore. I said, I know, right? So it's this knowingness that, and what I find really interesting about that, we see this convergence of a lot of thought right now, is the mystical traditions, yogic tradition has always been about how do you unite with your potential. That's the word yoga is union. And it's not just, you know, how physically fit can I be or how perfect can my triangle be, but like how can I actually use this practice and a variety of practices to actually connect with my own potential or the divine, right? That's the word. Whatever word works for you, but I think a very accessible term is like my potential. And these sound like, oh, that's a pretty like big idea, but it sometimes comes down to actually two very simple things. One is, well, before I even get to those, it's the constant acknowledgement that I am not a victim. I am not a victim. I'm not a victim. And we live in a very victim-centered culture. And I'm not saying that we all haven't been victims. We have all been victimized in some way. But we're not victims. There's a difference between being an ongoing victim and being victimized. And the difference is that a victim stays in the victimization even though it's over. You all know something happened to them 40 years ago and they're living like it's gonna happen any minute now and like it literally happened 5 minutes now. And I'm not saying that doesn't take work, but this is the decision of like, okay, I'm creating reality. What do I want to create even out of that? But to me, it's like this ongoing decision of I'm a creator, meaning I have tensionality in my life, or I'm a victim of circumstances, whatever that might be. And so if we make this decision of like, you know, I want to be a creator, and I'm not saying that we don't all have moments where we're like whiny bitches about things, right? But it's also to say, okay, what do I want to be experiencing in my life? Because I know if I'm creating reality that the more I give my focus to, the more I get. You ever notice that? You wake up on the wrong side of the bed and then like your whole day, unless you correct your mood, and thinking is a gong show. I remember I met a woman and she was like so freaked out about identity theft. And I remember having a conversation with her going, really? She's like, you don't worry about that? I said, it's never crossed my mind. This woman had been a victim of identity theft 4 times. You think that's coincidental? Of course not. And in Canada, I mean, we don't have the same issues with identity theft that the US does. I thought, wow, this is so interesting. This is such a great example of I'm so focused on something and they're manifesting. So we're using these practices, these experiences to help us connect to our own potential. And what does that really mean? To me, there's like 2 things. One is I am cognizant, I'm aware of what am I thinking about? What am I actually thinking about, you know? And not to say that it's all like I'm not going to think about responsibilities or accountabilities or confrontations or whatever I may need to manage in my life. But it's like, how am I thinking about what I'm thinking about? Do you get me? So all of us have things that we need to, you know, deal with or put ourselves out there or whatever it is in a certain way, but it's how we're thinking about what I'm thinking about. And the second thing is actually, like, what decisions are you making? Like, what decisions am I making in my life? And yesterday we talked about, you know, becoming the like Reserva wine. It's like, that's a decision. And so it's really, really simple. Anytime I find myself like I'm moving into that victim mindset or I'm going into like old habits, I just like, you know, you're the creator here. You get to decide what you think about. And then you get to decide to decide. And those are really the two things, you know, like how we're thinking about things and then the actions we take, that's your life in many ways. Like it kind of dictates the quality of your life. Because again, if you look at somebody, you're like, oh, that person doesn't seem very like happy or fulfilled or rewarded. It's like, how are they thinking about anything? And what decisions are they making? And not making a decision, that's a decision. So the good news around all of this is that it's actually good news, that we can say, you know, it doesn't really matter where I came from or what's happened to me in my life. And that this is why when I came to the path of yoga in my like mid to late 20s, I was really looking for something to help me shift out of like a very angry mindset, a very victimized mindset, a very like perfectionist mindset. And it was like, oh my God, I remember hearing the first time, like, you can actually create your reality. It was like, how come I didn't know this? This is amazing. But then what goes along with it then is the invitation and the encouragement to say, well, who do I want to be in the creation of that reality? Isn't that cool? I mean, and we're surrounded again by this like beauty and art, and those are intentionalities. You know, if you look at artists, there's an intentionality. Yes, source energy is moving, but source energy is moving through you too. And if you think of yourself as the artist in your own life, it's like, what do I want that to look like? What do I want my own life, my experience, even this moment to look like for myself? And you get to choose. And you can also choose anything. You know, you can choose, we can choose to be unhappy, we can choose to be miserable, we can choose to be grateful, we can choose to be celebratory. And it's really just, you know, it's such a choice. And something I think it's great to have a, you know, a reminder of that too. Like how am I thinking about what I'm thinking? How am I thinking about what I'm thinking? And then what are the decisions that I'm making? So, questions about that?
Decisions about what to eat.
Yeah, even that too.
About where to go eat last night. It's a tough decision, wasn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it ended up so good.
Yes.
At the end. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And even something as simple as like, what am I going to eat? There's like that, okay, what is it that has a longer term nourishment value? What is it that's actually good? What feels good for me? All of those things, you know. And it's interesting because even when it comes to food, I know we're in the land of food, but you know, we see that people like, and I have had a lot of like digestive issues, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about food as well, but how much energy we put into thinking about food, but we don't always do that in other areas of our life. I just observe that at times. Like we get like this crazy amount of energy thinking about food and diet and all of that, which I think is good, but there's also food going in here. There's food going into your mind. And it's also to be discerning around that, you know, like what's going in here that's actually going to be positive and help me be in those places, or is like kind of like junk, you know, or might have like a moment of sweetness and then it's like, oh shit, I shouldn't have eaten that. Ever had those? And it's kind of the same here, you know? So those are good. I mean, it's a great example as well. So and we all get to choose. You get to choose. So this. Go ahead, Sharon.
I was just going to say yesterday, Rachel and I ran into a couple of Aussies. We were talking to a couple of Aussies, and you probably didn't hear the conversation. The one guy started talking about his mind was going all over, and I said, "Oh, you have monkey mind," and he had never heard that term, and so I tried to explain, well, why monkey? Like, you know, but so here's a man probably, you know, closer to our age, and that. And I thought it was interesting when you stop to think about it, a man sort of verbalizing how his mind is going, you know, and that's half the battle, I always said, was, you know, the awareness of what's happening.
No question, totally. I actually think awareness is like, yeah, even more than half the battle. Since you said, Sharon, like,
It is.
we actually are powerless until we have awareness. And then at least, you know, sometimes say to Ian, listen, I'm just gonna have a meltdown for 5 seconds, and I need you to just let me have a fucking meltdown for 5 seconds. I know it's not the conscious thing to do, but I'm just gonna have a meltdown, but at least I'm aware.
Right.
So once I have awareness, then I can say, well, now I have a choice. And whatever you're choosing, at least there's intentionality around it. And this is where, you know, so much of what I teach and we teach together is like moving things. I always think of it as like a literal move, like out of subconscious mind. You know, and you meet people, and this is the interesting thing about this is like, I think it was with Linda. I think it was Linda. We were talking about, it might have been Rachel, how in Italian culture there's just an assumption that you sit down and have coffee and a glass of wine. Like you make time for that. So you have a disagreement with somebody. Who was I talking to about this?
Well, you
Rachel. Okay.
Yeah,
That's it. And it was like, that's the ideology, right? Like that's the thinking here. And then, you know, you go to another culture and we don't have time for that. And I'm not criticizing our culture. I mean, there's other ways of handling things, but there's awareness. Like we get so used to something being a certain way. And it's why I think, you know, Ian and I are so passionate about travel and bringing people to different places, because even in Italy, which we would still see as like a Western culture, there's these subtle variations that are really enriching, right? And it goes, okay, I have to think about this, you know, like, how am I handling things? Is there something I can take from this? Because it triggered something in my awareness. It's like, oh, I wasn't even aware that you could do things like that. And, you know, there's also, I love that there's no accident that that man met you guys because he needed that awareness. And now, even if it's like a fleeting thought, you can say, okay, well, hang on a second, I met that beautiful Canadian woman and she told me that I could actually like,
Monkey mind.
yeah. And you don't know until you know.
But there was this, he couldn't figure out what was going, like, he was really sort of anxious about what's going on in my mind, sort of thing. And so he was sort of shocked to think that there was a term for it, and that it, I think, natural, that I casually said, oh, that's monkey mind, you know. But, yeah, you know, it's just funny timing.
Yeah, it's very empowering actually to learn, like, oh, that's great. Yeah. So this morning we're gonna actually just flow through a little bit more like vinyasa and sun salutes. So always everything is an invitation for yourself in terms of what feels good for me. Don't compare, don't worry about things in terms of this feels a little more challenging or this feels easier, whatever it is. Because those are now, it's like, this is the opportunity, right? Of like, I need to look at how I'm thinking about things. And then making decisions about that. And that's really, for me, you know, I love being physically fit, I like working out, but I always think of like the yoga asanas as like, it's my observation time. I get to see like what's going on in here and in here and in here. And to, you know, create a deeper relationship with that. So think of it more that way, like what's going on in here, and to be that observer of all of that. Cool? All right, so we will be at the notes. Thank you everybody, standing.